and welcome to When Zip Code Doesn't Matter. I'm Katie McKenna, a director in the Denver market of Enterprise Community Partners.
And I'm Maria Sepulveda, VP of Government and Community Partnerships at Habitat for Humanity of Metro Denver.
In this module, we'll discuss the roots of residential segregation, its persistence today, and what steps can be taken to make sure that everyone, regardless of race, can live in the community of their choosing and have access to the resources and the opportunities that they need. Very few Americans live in neighborhoods that are affordable and green, close to jobs, and racially and economically integrated, to the point where it's a relatively common view that such communities are an idealistic or utopian vision, rather than an achievable goal or a national necessity. Today, well over half a century since the civil rights movement fought for the principle that separate is inherently unequal, real estate industry practices and local public policies have not been held accountable for making very little progress on integrating our neighborhoods. If we want to see progress on inclusion and racial justice, industry and policymakers will have to work together to dismantle these systems and replace them with ones that nurture opportunity, connection, and inclusion. Let's turn to a mapping tool to see just how segregated the Denver metro area is today. American cities are sometimes referred to as melting pots, where people of different backgrounds, ethnicities, and races live together and enhance each other's lives. A more accurate description may be a TV dinner. All of the food's in the box, but it doesn't necessarily mix together. Justice Map is a tool that allows us to see where people live by race. Looking at the map on our screen, it's plain to see that in the Denver metro area, people of different races live in different parts of town. White people are represented on the map with the purple colors, Hispanic people with blues, and Black people represented with the red shades. Let's take a look back in history to see how this happened. During the Great Depression, millions of people couldn't afford their housing payments. New home building ground to a halt, repairs went undone, and the number of people living on the streets was unprecedented. In response, the Public Works Administration, an arm of the federal government, built the first ever civilian public housing. From the beginning, public housing upheld segregationist values. The very first housing project, in fact, was built in 1935 in Atlanta, Georgia, and it displaced hundreds of Black families to make way for 604 units of white-only public housing. The Public Housing Act of 1937 and the Housing Act of 1949 further expanded public housing, paving the way for hundreds of thousands of homes, maintaining that it must be segregated.
You know, this reminds me of my own family's story. My mom often shares that when she grew up in the early 30s, she lived near Central Park in New York City. And she lived in a 3-story walk-up that had families from different income levels, different backgrounds, and different ethnicities. She often remembers how a white elderly heiress lived on the top floor, and she would come down the stairs with big rings and fur coats, but in the same building, a Black postman lived. So there was a lot of diversity in that one walk-up. She remembers that one day her parents said, "We got to move. We have to move uptown, way uptown." And it was the first time that she ever lived in a completely segregated neighborhood with only Black and brown folks. It turns out when we looked it up on the website, this was one of the first completely segregated public housing projects built by the federal government only for Black residents in 1936. During the 70s and for decades, this highly segregated neighborhood suffered all of this disinvestment and social and economic devastation that we know plagues formerly redlined neighborhoods. So while the type of public housing my mom lived in contributed to concentration of disadvantage and segregation, it wasn't the only problem. Franklin D. Roosevelt, through the New Deal, aimed to end the Great Depression and bring prosperity back to the US. Take a minute to guess what percentage of Americans owned homes prior to the 1930s? Well, prior to the 1930s, only about 30% of Americans owned their own home. To buy a home, a large down payment was required, and most mortgages were only 10 years long.
So in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was charged with making homeownership more accessible. The FHA revolutionized home buying by ensuring private loans, allowing banks to offer mortgages that could be repaid over 30 years with just 10% down. The FHA established homeownership as a tool for wealth generation and stability and used it to bolster national pride after the Depression. But not for everyone. The FHA would only insure mortgage loans for white people and in areas where white people lived and owned businesses, as documented on maps like the one on your screen. Denver, like all other cities, was built around its redlining map. The red and yellow areas on the screen are where people of color lived and where lending was severely restricted. The green and blue areas where white people lived in mostly white parts of town, lending was abundant. If you picture an upside down L over the map, you can see where the formerly redlined neighborhoods are. In the following slides, we're going to overlay socioeconomic conditions onto this redlining map. Looking for this inverted L can help you see where inequity is in Denver and where millions of taxpayer dollars poured into white neighborhoods, while neighborhoods where non-white people live struggled with little investment and increasing poverty as the racial wealth divide took hold. Using race as a proxy for credit risk and future property value guaranteed that the white communities would prosper, while communities of color would be subject to predatory lending practices. While mapping tools make it simple to see, residential segregation is a complex dynamic created intentionally by more than a century of policy. In his book, The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein provides a deep analysis of the policies that segregated our cities. It's a common misconception that the reason that neighborhoods were segregated in the past and still are today is due to personal prejudice and choice. This is also called de facto segregation. The Supreme Court has called things like income differences, private discrimination in the real estate industry, or just unwelcoming neighborhood groups de facto segregation. De jure segregation, on the other hand, exists because of local laws and regulations that mandated racial separation. The redlining laws are an example of de jure segregation. To the extent that our modern zoning code reinforces residential segregation, they're also de jure because there are regulations. Rothstein disputes that de facto segregation is responsible for the racial division seen in every metropolitan area, and demonstrates that de jure segregation in the form of racially explicit federal, state, and local policy plays a much stronger role in who lives where in our cities today. This distinction is critical because if segregation is something that happened by individual choice, it's hard to imagine how we would remedy it. On the other hand, if government action successfully segregated cities, equally effective government action should be able to do just the opposite. So if the Civil Rights Act is more than 50 years old, how can we still be so segregated? I think there are two main reasons. First, because we're not very good at history. We've forgotten, or maybe never even learned, the history we talked about a few minutes ago. And we've told ourselves that where we live is de facto or by choice, when actually it's de jure, resulting from racially motivated public policy over generations. And secondly, public policy that separates us by race still exists today. For example, municipalities use zoning to limit the supply of available housing units by prohibiting apartment buildings in some neighborhoods or requiring lots to be far bigger than they need to be to fit a building. These ordinances can raise costs, making it less likely for lower income groups and people of color to be able to move into those communities. The location of non-residential uses also plays a big role. If you could choose, would you live by a bus depot with buses zipping in and out at all hours, or a sprawling university campus, or a park? Municipalities, our planning departments, decide where things we want to live near are built and where things we don't want to live near are built. The same goes for public infrastructure, like highways and public transit lines. We've already determined that single-family areas cost more and can, for that reason, exclude people of color. We also know that these areas have more desirable non-residential uses, which makes the area more desirable and more exclusive. These next two slides are, for me, one of the main reasons we have to make changes. On this slide, economic stability indicators are compared to the historical red lines of the 1930s. The lighter the color, the less economic security people who live in those neighborhoods have. And you can see the lightest areas almost exactly fall within the red and yellow lines of the past. The same story shows up in education. Here, the lighter the color, the less educational success. And you can see the lightest areas fall almost exactly within the red and yellow lines of the past. So let's do something about it. First, we need to make changes to our zoning codes to allow for diverse housing options in all communities. One step that you can take is to schedule a meeting with your city council person to tell them to preserve housing diversity in your community, or that you'd like to see more of it if you don't feel like you have enough. Next, let's increase the supply of affordable housing. Get online and research affordable housing in your community. Share your opinion with your council person and actively support organizations who are working on affordable housing. You could volunteer or even donate. On top of all of this, we need equitable distribution of assets and hazards. Pay close attention to public projects and investments that are happening near you. If you see something that disproportionately harms people of color or benefits white people, speak up. After learning more about the connections between redlining, residential segregation, and racial disparity today, I hope that you've had the opportunity to think about how you can be an agent for change in your own way. Please explore the other modules on this site and feel free to reach out to us anytime.